November 12, 1949, 11:45 p.m., the 28th Precinct, Harlem. The air in the precinct was thick with the smell of stale coffee, cheap cigars, and the kind of institutional dampness that clings to places built of brick and bureaucratic indifference. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson sat on a hard wooden bench, his hands cuffed behind his back. The steel felt cold and final against his wrists, a familiar but never welcome sensation. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, now slightly rumpled, a silk tie still perfectly knotted at his throat. Even in custody, Bumpy projected an aura of control, an immutability that infuriated the men who had brought him in. They'd swept into the Lenox Lounge on a Saturday night, a show of force orchestrated by a new captain eager to make a name for himself by caging Harlem's biggest lion. The charge was flimsy, extortion based on the word of a junkie informant they'd likely squeezed until he sang a song of their choosing. It was nuisance, a flexing of municipal muscle. But a nuisance could become a problem, and a problem could become a threat. Bumpy understood the calculus of power. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on a crack in the plaster wall, his mind a quiet, whirring engine of strategy and consequence. He wasn't in their world anymore. He was in a cage, and in a cage, the rules were different. The respect he commanded on Lenox Avenue meant less than nothing here. Here, he was just another colored man in cuffs, a statistic waiting to be filed. The indignity of it was a low, simmering heat in his belly. His empire, built on whispers and fear and the careful distribution of both favor and violence, was an intangible thing. It existed in the minds of men. An arrest like this, public and theatrical, could plant a seed of doubt. And doubt, like rot, could spread. Two officers, their faces flushed with the cheap victory, flanked the doorway. They watched him, their expressions a mixture of awe and contempt. They were watching a legend, a ghost from the newspapers, and they found him disappointingly human, confined by the same steel they used on common pickpockets. After an hour that stretched into an eternity of silence, a different man entered the room. He was older than the others, with a hard, fleshy face and pale, watery eyes that held a specific kind of deadness. This was Officer Daniel Callahan. He was a precinct legend of a different sort, known for his heavy hands and a bottomless well of racial animus that he dispensed with the casual cruelty of a man who knew he was protected by his badge and his skin. He didn't speak at first. He circled Bumpy slowly, like a jackal sizing up a wounded lion. He tapped his nightstick against his palm, a rhythmic, intimidating beat in the stale air. Bumpy didn't follow him with his eyes. He remained perfectly still, a statue of defiance. He had learned long ago that the greatest weapon against men like Callahan was to deny them the reaction they craved, to give them nothing. No fear, no anger, no pleading, just a void. Ellsworth Johnson, Callahan finally said, his voice a gravelly sneer. He pronounced the name with deliberate irony, as if tasting something foul. The King of Harlem. Look at you. Not so high and mighty in here. Are you, boy? Bumpy's jaw remained unclenched. His breathing was even. He was a master of the internal fortress, a man who could retreat so deep inside himself that the outside world became a distant noise. He was thinking of his wife, Mamie, and the worry that would be etching fine lines around her eyes. He was thinking of his daughter, Elise, and the world he was trying to build for her, a world where she would never have to know the inside of a room like this. That was the fuel for his stillness. Callahan leaned in close, his breath a foul mix of whiskey and decay. We got you this time. The captain's got a hard-on for this one. You're going away for a long, long time. Gonna be trading that fancy suit for a set of stripes. How's that feel, King? Still nothing. Bumpy's silence was an act of profound aggression. It was a wall Callahan couldn't breach with his usual tools of intimidation. He needed to crack the facade. He needed a reaction. He needed to see the man, not the myth. He straightened up, a nasty smile twisting his lips. He took a deep breath, puffed out his cheeks, and then he did it. He spat. A thick, wet glob of saliva flew through the air and landed squarely on Bumpy Johnson's cheek. It clung there for a moment before tracing a slow, viscous path down his skin, a trail of ultimate debasement. The two younger cops in the doorway shifted uncomfortably. Even for them, this was a line crossed. This was something personal, something vile. In the ringing silence that followed, The only sound was the drip of a leaky pipe somewhere down the hall. Callahan's chest was puffed out, his eyes gleaming with triumph. He had done the unspeakable. He had marked the king, branded him with his contempt in a way no handcuffs ever could. He waited for the explosion. For the curses, the threats, the futile struggle against the cuffs. He waited for Bumpy to break. November 12, 1949, 11:51 p.m. The 28th Precinct, Harlem. Bumpy Johnson did not break. He didn't flinch. He didn't even wipe the spittle from his face. For a long, stretched-out moment, he simply sat there, the vile liquid cooling on his skin. He could feel its weight, a physical manifestation of a lifetime of systemic hatred. He could smell the sourness of it. It was the smell of every back door he'd ever been forced to use, every slur whispered just loud enough for him to hear, every opportunity denied, every assumption made. It was the smell of the system that men like Callahan were sworn to protect. A universe of rage, cold and dense as a dying star, coalesced inside him. It was a rage so pure, so absolute, that it transcended emotion and became a state of being. It was a clarity. He knew, in that instant, exactly what he had to do, not just to Callahan, but for the idea of himself. If he allowed this act to stand, if the story that left this room was that Bumpy Johnson had been spat on and broken, his reign was over. Fear was his currency, and a man who could be so easily debased was a man no one would fear. A weak king was a dead king. He slowly, deliberately, lifted his head. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met Callahan's. And then, he did the last thing the officer expected. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a smirk. It was a grin that didn't touch his eyes. It was a slow, predatory stretching of the lips that revealed his teeth. It was the grin of a wolf that had just realized the shepherd was not only mortal, but also stupid. The grin was a promise. It was a contract written in silent, terrifying language. It said, "You have no idea what you have just done. You have mistaken my stillness for surrender. You have signed your own death warrant, but you will not have the mercy of a quick death." The effect on Callahan was immediate and profound. He visibly recoiled, his triumphant posture deflating. The grin was more unnerving than any physical threat. It was alien. It was the reaction of a man who operated by a different set of rules, a man who saw this ultimate humiliation not as a defeat, but as an opportunity. The officer's bravado evaporated, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear in his pale eyes. He had expected a beast, and when the beast didn't roar, it was 100 times more frightening. He had poked something ancient and calculating. The two younger cops saw it, too. They looked at each other, their expressions now laced with a dawning horror. They were witnessing a fundamental shift in power, even with one man in handcuffs and the other holding a nightstick. The spit was still on Bumpy's cheek, but it was Callahan who looked stained. Bumpy held the grin for another 5 seconds, letting the poison of it seep into the room, letting Callahan truly understand his mistake. Then, just as slowly, he let the grin fade, replaced by the same unnerving calm as before. He had made his point. He had turned Callahan's weapon back on him. The officer, flustered and suddenly desperate to reassert his dominance, barked at the other cops. "Get him out of my sight. Throw him in a holding cell. Let him rot." He turned and left the room without a backward glance, but his stride was too quick, his shoulders too tight. He was a man fleeing a ghost he had just created. As the officers roughly pulled Bumpy to his feet, he still didn't resist. He walked with a steady, measured pace toward the holding cells. He didn't wipe his face. He would wear the stain as a reminder. It was fuel. It was a vow. The physical humiliation was temporary. The retribution would be eternal. November 13th, 1949, 2:15 a.m. The Tombs, Manhattan Detention Complex. The transfer from the precinct to the Tombs was a blur of dirty squad cars and indifferent guards. Now, alone in a cell that smelled of urine and despair, the mask of control finally dissolved. But Bumpy Johnson did not cry. He did not scream or beat his fists against the cold stone walls. His breakdown was a quiet, internal affair, a descent into a place of cold, methodical fury. The grin was gone, replaced by a granite-hard expression. He sat on the edge of the thin, stained mattress, the spit long since dried on his cheek, a phantom sensation that made his skin crawl. He closed his eyes and replayed the moment. The sneer on Callahan's face. The guttural sound from his throat. The wet impact. The shared laughter of the other cops. A sound of complicity that was, in its own way, as violent as the act itself. He saw it not as an insult to his person, but as an existential threat to his world. Power, in his universe, was perception. It was the carefully constructed belief that he was untouchable, that he operated on a plane above the petty humiliations that plagued other men. Callahan hadn't just spat on a man. He had spat on a symbol. He had shown the world, or at least the small, violent world of the precinct, that the King of Harlem could be debased like any other man they dragged in off the street. That perception, if it spread, would be a cancer. It would embolden his rivals. It would make his collectors hesitate. It would invite challenges that could only be answered with bloodshed, destabilizing the fragile peace he had bought and paid for. His family's safety was guaranteed by his strength. If his strength was seen as a sham, Mamie and Elise were vulnerable. The thought sent a spike of ice through his veins. This was not about ego. It was about survival. It was about protecting the only two people on earth for whom he would burn the world to the ground. A guard shuffled past his cell, keys jangling. He was a fat, wheezing man with a cruel streak. He paused, peering in at Bumpy. Heard about what Callahan did, the guard said, a malicious chuckle in his voice. He's a piece of work, that one. Got a wife and a couple kids out in Queens. A little girl, I hear. Can you imagine a bastard like that having a daughter? The guard's words were meant to twist the knife, to highlight Bumpy's powerlessness. But they did something else entirely. For a fleeting, disorienting second, an image of Callahan's daughter flashed in Bumpy's mind. A little girl, innocent, unknowing of her father's darkness. It was a flicker of a shared humanity, a connection between two fathers from opposite sides of a chasm. The thought was a false alarm of empathy, a momentary misstep on the path of his rage. He almost felt a pang of something akin to pity. This man, this monster, had a weakness, a vulnerability that mirrored Bumpy's own. The thought was dangerous. Mercy was a luxury he could not afford. The memory of the spit, the feel of it on his skin, rushed back and extinguished the flicker of compassion instantly. The guard had not given him a reason for restraint. He had given him a target. He had handed Bumpy the key to Callahan's soul. The guard moved on, satisfied that he had tormented the prisoner. He had no idea he had just armed him. Bumpy's focus narrowed. The rage was no longer a diffuse, burning cloud. It was now a laser, pointed and precise. The objective was clear. He would not just punish Callahan. He would dismantle him. He would hollow him out from the inside, using the very things the man held dear. He would make Callahan understand that there are lines you do not cross, not with a man like him. He would make him a living example, a ghost to haunt the dreams of any other cop who thought Bumpy Johnson was just another Negro in a cage. The price for that spit would not be paid in blood. It would be paid in fear, in servitude, in the slow, agonizing destruction of a man's soul. November 14th, 1949, 9 a.m., outside the Manhattan Detention Complex. The morning sun was a pale, watery thing, struggling to cut through the city's gray haze. Bumpy emerged from the tombs, his lawyer at his side, the trumped-up charges already crumbling under the weight of paid-for legal maneuvering. He was wearing the same suit, a silent testament to the night he had endured. The first thing he did was take a handkerchief from his pocket and slowly, meticulously, wipe his face, though the physical evidence of the insult was long gone. It was a symbolic act, a cleansing before the war to come. Waiting at the curb was a gleaming black Cadillac, and leaning against it, his face a mask of loyal concern, was Junie Bird. Junie was more than Bumpy's lieutenant. He was his shadow, his confidant, the man who translated his will into action on the street. He was tall and wiry, always impeccably dressed, with eyes that missed nothing. He opened the rear door without a word, his expression asking the question his voice dared not. Bumpy slid onto the plush leather seat. The door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, shutting out the noise of the city and the stench of the jail. For a moment, there was only the quiet hum of the engine. "They tell me what happened, Bumpy," Junie said softly, his voice low and tight with restrained fury. "They said a cop. I know what they said." Bumpy cut him off, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. He stared out the window as the Cadillac pulled smoothly into traffic, leaving the grim facade of the tombs behind. It happened. Junie waited. He knew Bumpy well enough to know that this silence was not weakness. It was the calm before a hurricane. It was the sound of gears turning, of a plan being forged in the fires of a cold and patient rage. Finally, Bumpy turned his head, his eyes meeting Junie's in the rearview mirror. "I want him," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. "I don't want him hurt. Not yet. I don't want him dead. That is too kind. I want to own him. I need to know everything. The name of the man who delivers his milk. The brand of cigarettes his wife smokes. The nightmares his children have. I want to know where he eats, where he sleeps, who he loves, and who he owes. I want to know the name of his dog." Junie nodded slowly, his face grim. He understood the directive perfectly. This was not a simple act of revenge. This was a deconstruction, a meticulous, soul-crushing campaign to erase a man's identity and replace it with servitude. "His name is Callahan. Daniel Callahan," Junie said. 28th Precinct, get it done, Bumpy ordered. The car fell silent again as they drove uptown, back toward the familiar streets of Harlem, back to the heart of Bumpy's kingdom. The moment they crossed 110th Street, the atmosphere shifted. Bumpy was home, but the insult from downtown had followed him. He could feel it, an invisible stain on his reputation. He had to wash it clean, and the only soap that would work was the absolute and total subjugation of the man who had disrespected him. The search began the moment Junie stepped out of the car. It was a quiet, insidious mobilization. Whispers in back alleys, money passed in smoky bars, calls made from payphones. Bumpy's network, a vast and intricate web of informants, numbers runners, prostitutes, and street hustlers, came alive. The search for leverage was on, a desperate hunt against the ticking clock of rumor and reputation. November 14th, 1949, 11:30 a.m. A numbers runner who worked the route in Queens called in with an address. A small, tidy brick house in Astoria, with a carefully tended rosebush out front. Callahan's Castle. November 14th, 1949, 2 p.m. A prostitute who sometimes entertained cops at an off-the-books social club provided names. The wife, Mary. A son, Michael, aged 12. A daughter, Sarah, aged 9. She mentioned that Callahan was always complaining about money, always behind on his payments to a bookie named Shifty Lou. November 14th, 1949, 6 p.m. One of Junie's men tailed Callahan from the precinct. He didn't go straight home. He went to an Irish pub called the Blarney Stone. He drank heavily for 2 hours, his laughter loud and boastful. He was telling the story of how he spat on the King of Harlem. The clock was ticking faster now. The poison was spreading. November 14th, 1949, 9 p.m. An informant who cleaned rooms at a flophouse hotel in the Lower East Side reported that Callahan kept a regular Tuesday and Thursday appointment in room 2B. He wasn't meeting his bookie. He was meeting a woman, a redhead named Dolores. This was more than just a marital indiscretion. This was a pattern of behavior, a life of secrets. And secrets were leverage. Junie compiled the information, each piece and nail to be hammered into Callahan's coffin. But it wasn't enough. Infidelity and gambling debts were common vices. To truly own a man like Callahan, Bumpy needed something more. He needed something dark, something that the badge couldn't protect him from. The search continued into the night, deeper and deeper into the shadows of Officer Daniel Callahan's life. November 15th, 1949, 8:30 p.m. A seedy apartment in the Lower East Side. The air in the hallway outside room 2B of the St. Mark's Hotel was a potent cocktail of boiled cabbage, unwashed bodies, and cheap gin. 2 of Junie's men, dressed as telephone repairmen, had been watching the room for hours. They were ghosts, professionals at the art of being unseen. They had watched Dolores, the redhead, leave for her shift at a downtown diner. They had waited another hour to be sure she was gone for good. Junie arrived, his movements silent and precise. He picked the cheap lock on the door with practiced ease. The room was small and squalid, a testament to a life lived on the margins. A single unmade bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a hot plate stained with the ghosts of 100 miserable meals. The place smelled of stale cigarette smoke and Dolores's cheap, cloying perfume. It was the smell of desperation. Junie didn't come here looking for evidence of an affair that was already established. He was following a hunch, a whisper from an informant who said Callahan was living far beyond the means of a beat cop, even a corrupt one. Gambling debts and a mistress cost money. Bumpy needed to know where that money came from. Check everywhere, Junie said quietly to his men. We're not looking for cash. We're looking for the source. They worked with a quiet efficiency, a choreographed search that left no corner untouched. They checked under the mattress, inside the water tank of the toilet, behind the peeling wallpaper. Nothing. It was one of Junie's men, a quiet ex-burglar named Silas, who found it. He noticed a section of the linoleum floor under the bed that didn't sit quite right. He used a pocket knife to pry it up, revealing a small, hollow space beneath the floorboards. Inside was a shoebox. Junie took the box and placed it on the dresser. He lifted the lid. It wasn't filled with money. It was filled with small glassine bags, each containing a white powder. Heroin. A lot of it. Enough to supply half the junkies on the Lower East Side for a month. And nestled amongst the bags was a precinct evidence logbook, its pages filled with neat columns of dates, case numbers, and descriptions of seized narcotics. Several entries had been crossed out, with a small, neat, destroyed, written in the margin. The handwriting matched the scrawled notes on the back of a racing form peeking out of the trash can. It was Callahan's. This was it. This was the discovery. The Achilles heel. Callahan wasn't just a racist brute on the take from bookies. He was a dealer. He was skimming dope from the evidence locker, dope seized from Italian crews, no less, and using his mistress's apartment as a stash house. This was a crime that couldn't be explained away. It was a betrayal of his badge, a betrayal of his fellow cops, and, most dangerously, a theft from the mafia. If the Italians found out a cop was stealing their product, they would kill him. If his own department found out, he'd be thrown in prison for 20 years. This was the near-death discovery Bumpy had been searching for, the existential threat that would give him total control. Callahan's life was now officially over. He just didn't know it yet. Junie took a small camera from his coat pocket. He laid out the bags of heroin and the logbook on the dresser and took several clear, damning photographs. He then put everything back exactly as he had found it, replacing the floorboard with meticulous care. They had what they needed. They were ghosts once more, slipping out of the building and melting back into the city's shadows, leaving behind a time bomb ticking away under the floor of room 2B. The trap was now set. All that was left was to spring it. November 16, 1949, 10:15 p.m. Outside the Blarney Stone, Queens. The night was cold, a damp chill that promised winter. Steam rose from the sewer grates, swirling in the yellow glow of the streetlights. Officer Daniel Callahan pushed through the door of the Blarney Stone, a blast of warm, stale air and raucous laughter following him out. He was drunk, but it was a confident, boisterous drunk. His steps were steady, his head held high. For the past 2 nights, he had been the hero of the Precinct bar, the man who had finally put the fear of God into the untouchable Bumpy Johnson. He was dining out on the story of the spit, each telling more embellished, more heroic than the last. In his version, Bumpy had trembled, had pleaded, had broken into tears. The lie felt good. It made him feel powerful, a feeling that was otherwise in short supply in his life of mounting debts and quiet desperation. He fumbled for the keys to his Ford sedan, a feeling of supreme satisfaction washing over him. He had faced down the devil and won. He got into his car, the engine turning over with a reluctant cough. He was about to pull away from the curb when a black Cadillac, its headlights off, materialized out of the darkness and blocked him in. Before he could even process what was happening, his passenger side door opened. Junie Bird slid into the seat beside him. He moved with a liquid grace that was both elegant and deeply menacing. "Evening, Officer Callahan," Junie said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished stone. Mr. Johnson would like a word. Callahan's drunken bravado instantly curdled into fear. His hand instinctively went to the service revolver holstered on his hip. "Don't," Junie said softly, his eyes never leaving Callahan's. The word was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. Callahan froze. He saw another man standing by the driver's side window, a large, impassive figure who looked like he could snap a man's neck with one hand. He was trapped. "I don't know any Mr. Johnson," Callahan stammered, his voice suddenly thick. Junie didn't argue. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. He held it up in the dim light of the dashboard. It was a picture of a young girl with pigtails and a missing front tooth, laughing as she skipped down the street. She was holding a schoolbook. It was his daughter, Sarah. A wave of nausea and terror washed over Callahan. His blood ran cold. This wasn't about a barroom story anymore. This was about his family. "She's a beautiful girl," Junie said, his voice still unnervingly calm. It'd be a shame if anything were to happen. A world full of accidents. Callahan could barely breathe. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Junie put the photo of Sarah away and took out another. This one showed a collection of glassine bags and an evidence logbook arranged on a cheap dresser. Callahan's world tilted on its axis. The stash. The heroin. His secret life laid bare in a single, damning photograph. He felt the floor drop out from beneath him. This was checkmate. He was utterly, completely ruined. "Drive," Junie said, "and follow the car in front of us. No sudden moves. No mistakes. We know where Mary and Michael are sleeping right now. We know where Sarah dreams." The threat was absolute, delivered with the casual precision of a surgeon. The high-stakes extraction was complete. It had been executed not with fists or guns, but with information and fear. They hadn't kidnapped Callahan's body. They had kidnapped his future. Defeated, his face pale and slick with sweat, Callahan put the car in gear and did as he was told. He drove through the quiet streets of his own neighborhood, a prisoner in his own car, following the phantom taillights of the Cadillac into the darkness, toward a reckoning he knew he could not escape. He was no longer a hero cop. He was a dead man, driving to his own funeral. November 16th, 1949, 11 p.m. The back office of the Lenox Lounge, Harlem. The office was Bumpy's sanctuary, a place of quiet power insulated from the jazz and laughter of the club outside. The walls were paneled in dark wood, the air scented with expensive brandy and cigar smoke. Bumpy sat behind a large mahogany desk, a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. He wasn't looking at the door. He was studying a chessboard, his fingers tracing the path of a black knight. He didn't need to see Callahan enter to feel the man's terror radiating into the room. Junie and the other man led the disgraced cop into the office and positioned him in a straight-back chair in front of the desk. Then they retreated, closing the door softly behind them, leaving the two men alone in the charged silence. Callahan sat ramrod straight, his hands clutching the seat of the chair, his face a mess of sweat and fear. He was a man stripped bare of all his defenses. His badge meant nothing here. His bravado was a distant memory. He was in the heart of Bumpy Johnson's kingdom, and he was there by invitation. For a full minute, Bumpy didn't speak. He simply continued to study the chessboard, moving a piece with a soft click. The sound was deafening in the silence. It was a deliberate display of control, a masterclass in psychological warfare. He was communicating to Callahan that this meeting was on his time, by his rules. He was an inconvenience, a minor problem to be dealt with before returning to more important matters. Finally, Bumpy looked up. His eyes were cold and flat, betraying none of the rage that had been simmering for days. "Officer Callahan," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "We have a problem. You and I." Callahan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I don't know what you're talking about," he managed to say, the lie weak and pathetic even to his own ears. Bumpy leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "Let's not waste each other's time with games. I am a busy man. You, on the other hand, have a great deal of time ahead of you. Whether you spend that time with your family in Queens or in a cell in Sing Sing depends entirely on this conversation." He slid the photographs across the polished surface of the desk. The picture of Sarah. The picture of the heroine. "You are a thief and an adulterer," Bumpy stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. "You steal from your own department. Worse, you steal from men who would put you in the East River for a fraction of what you've taken. You have a wife, Mary, who thinks you're a hero. You have a son, Michael, who probably looks up to you. And you have a daughter, Sarah. She has your eyes." Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling Callahan's identity piece by piece. This was the withdrawal, the stripping away of the lies he told himself, the arrogance, the sense of impunity. He was being forced to see himself through Bumpy's eyes, a pathetic, corrupt, and eminently controllable little man. "This isn't about the drugs, Callahan," Bumpy continued, his voice dropping even lower. "This is about respect. It is the only currency that matters. You stand on a street corner, and you see a man like me, a Negro. You see the suit, the car, the way people part when I walk by, and it burns you. Because in your world, I'm not supposed to have those things. I'm supposed to be shining your shoes, or worse. You can't stand the sight of me, so you find a way to make me small. You get me in a cage, and you spit on me. You thought you were spitting on a man, but you weren't. You were spitting on an idea. Callahan began to tremble, a low, uncontrollable shaking. He was coming apart at the seams. What you failed to understand, Bumpy said, his voice laced with a chilling philosophical calm, is that the power I have isn't in my fists. It's in my head. It's in my ability to see the world for what it is. A collection of levers. You just showed me all of yours, the dam broke. Callahan slumped forward in the chair, his face in his hands, and began to sob. Deep, racking, pathetic sobs of a man who has lost everything. Please, he begged, his voice muffled by his hands. Please, don't. My family. They don't know. It'll kill them. Please, I'll do anything. Anything you want. Bumpy watched him, his expression unchanged. He let him cry. He let him beg. He let him sit in the wreckage of his own life for what felt like an eternity. This was the moment from the title. The officer, once so full of hate and bravado, was now a broken thing, begging for mercy from the man he had tried to dehumanize. November 17, 1949, 12:05 a.m. The back office of the Lenox Lounge. The sound of Callahan's weeping filled the office, a pathetic symphony of a man's utter collapse. Bumpy Johnson let the sound play out, listening to it with the detached interest of a connoisseur. This was the sound of a soul being broken, the sound of power shifting irrevocably. When the sobs finally subsided into ragged, hitching breaths, Bumpy spoke again, his voice cutting through the quiet. Mercy, he said, tasting the word. You want mercy? The same mercy you showed me when you spat in my face. Callahan looked up, his face blotchy and streaked with tears, his eyes pleading. That was a mistake. A stupid, terrible mistake. I was drunk. I wasn't thinking. You were thinking, Bumpy corrected him calmly. You were thinking that I was helpless. That you could do anything you wanted to me because you had a badge and I had cuffs on. You were thinking that I was less than you. That is what you were thinking. He paused, letting the truth of the statement settle in the space between them. I am not going to kill you, Callahan. I am not going to expose you. Your wife will continue to think you are a hero. Your son will continue to look up to you. Your daughter will be safe. A flicker of desperate hope ignited in Callahan's eyes. It was a foolish, premature thing. Because you are going to be more useful to me alive than dead, Bumpy continued, extinguishing the hope as quickly as it had appeared. From this day forward, you belong to me. You are my man inside the 28th Precinct. When I need to know about a raid, you will tell me. When I need a charge to disappear, you will make it disappear. When one of my men is arrested, you will ensure his comfort and speedy release. You will be my eyes and my ears inside that station house. You will anticipate their moves against me, and you will report them. To me. And only to me. This was the deal. It was not a partnership. It was enslavement. Callahan would keep his life, his family, his job. But his soul, his will, his very conscience, now belonged to Bumpy Johnson. He would wear his uniform every day as a costume, a hollow shell of a man secretly serving the very person he was supposed to be putting away. In return, Bumpy said, your gambling debts will be paid. Your mistress will be provided for, discreetly. Your family will remain untouched. But you will never forget who you work for. If you ever hesitate, if you ever think of betraying me, I want you to look at your daughter's face. I want you to imagine her future without a father. Do you understand? Callahan, broken and defeated, could only nod, his body shaking. Yes, he whispered. I understand. Good, Bumpy said. He stood up. The meeting concluded. He walked to the door and opened it. Junie Bird was waiting in the hall. Junie will be your point of contact. You will never see me again unless you fail me. Go home to your wife, Officer Callahan. And remember your new obligations. Callahan stumbled to his feet and walked out of the office on unsteady legs. A man who had entered as a prideful cop and was leaving as a possession. He didn't look back. Bumpy watched him go, a sense of cold, grim satisfaction settling over him. He had won. He had taken the ultimate act of disrespect and forged it into a powerful new weapon. He had not only restored his authority, he had expanded it, planting a seed of his own power right in the heart of his enemy's fortress. It was a masterful victory, a perfect revenge. But as he stood there in the silent office, the smell of Callahan's fear still lingering in the air, he couldn't shake a subtle, disquieting feeling. A move this bold, this deep into the machinery of the law, would have consequences. It would create ripples. And Bumpy knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the ripples from this night would eventually come back to him as a tidal wave. July 22, 1951. Foley Square, Federal Courthouse. 2 years. For 2 years, the arrangement worked flawlessly. Officer Callahan, now Sergeant Callahan, thanks to a few well-placed tips from Bumpy's organization that led to heroic arrests, was the perfect asset. He was a ghost in the machine, feeding Bumpy a steady stream of invaluable intelligence. Raids were thwarted before they began. Rival operations were disrupted by precisely timed police interference. Key witnesses against Bumpy's interests suddenly found themselves arrested on unrelated and often fabricated charges. Bumpy's control over Harlem became tighter, more absolute than ever before. The story of the spit never became a legend of Bumpy's weakness. Instead, it became a terrifying myth of his power, the story of a cop who crossed him and simply vanished from the precinct, only to reappear a week later as a docile, compliant servant. Bumpy had turned humiliation into a cornerstone of his legend. But the wave he had created was gathering strength in waters he couldn't see. His manipulation of the NYPD was too clean, too effective. It drew a different kind of attention, not from the local precinct captains he could buy or intimidate, but from the federal government. The FBI and the Treasury Department, tasked with cracking down on organized crime, saw a pattern. They saw a criminal enterprise that was seemingly immune to local law enforcement. They began to investigate not Bumpy's crimes, but the police department's failure to prosecute them. They put wiretaps on precinct phones. They leaned on low-level mob informants. And eventually, they found the source of the rot, Sergeant Daniel Callahan. They squeezed him, and squeezed him hard. Faced with a federal indictment for conspiracy, drug trafficking, and obstruction of justice, and the Italians who now knew who had been stealing their dope, Callahan did what all weak men do. He talked. He told them everything. The federal case against Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, was airtight. It wasn't about numbers or extortion. It was about the cold, hard fact of his control over a police sergeant. It was a charge he couldn't beat. Bumpy stood before the judge, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his face an impassive mask. Mamie sat in the front row, her expression a portrait of dignified grief. He was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Alcatraz, the Rock, the end of the line. The separation was the true price of his victory over Callahan. To reassert his honor, to protect his family from the perception of weakness, he had set in motion the very events that would tear him away from them. The irony was a bitter pill. The long years on Alcatraz were a study in suspended animation. The world moved on without him. His power on the streets of Harlem evaporated, his empire carved up by hungrier, less disciplined men. All he had left were the letters. Letters from Mamie, filled with news of the neighborhood, reassurances of her love, and the quiet pain of her loneliness. And the photographs. Pictures of Elise. Elise at 10, with the same gap-toothed smile as Callahan's daughter in the photo Junie had shown him. Elise at 13, awkward and beautiful in her first formal dress. Elise at 16, beaming in a cap and gown at her high school graduation. Elise at 18, standing on a college campus, a confident young woman ready to take on the world. He kept the photos in a worn leather folio, studying them until the faces were etched into his memory. He watched his daughter grow up in two-dimensional silence, a ghost in his own family's life. He read her report cards, her letters about boys and books and dreams for the future. He was a father separated from his daughter by 1,000 miles of water and steel, all because of an act of defiance born from a glob of spit 2 years and a lifetime ago. The rage that had fueled him had cooled, replaced by a deep, aching void. He had protected his kingdom, but lost his world. February 5, 1963. San Francisco Bay. The ferry cut through the choppy, gray waters of the bay, leaving the grim silhouette of Alcatraz behind. Bumpy Johnson stood on the deck, a free man. He was 61 years old. The sharp edges of his anger had been worn smooth by time. His black hair was now shot through with silver, and his face was a roadmap of lessons learned in solitude. He wore a simple, ill-fitting suit provided by the prison, a far cry from the tailored elegance of his past. The world he was returning to was not the one he had left. The country was on the cusp of a revolution he had only read about in newspapers. Harlem, he knew from Mamie's letters, was a different place, ravaged by drugs and poverty in ways he could scarcely imagine. He was an old king returning to a kingdom that no longer remembered his rule. Waiting for him at the ferry terminal was Junie Bird. Junie was older, too, his face more lined, but his loyalty was an unwavering constant. He clasped Bumpy in a firm embrace, a silent acknowledgement of the years that had been stolen. "It's good to have you home, Bumpy," Junie said, his voice thick with emotion. The drive from the airport back to Harlem was a surreal journey through time. The city was louder, faster, more crowded. The buildings were taller, the cars sleeker. When they finally crossed into Harlem, Bumpy stared out the window, a stranger in his own land. The vibrant energy he remembered was still there, but it was frayed, laced with a desperation that hadn't been so naked before. He saw boarded-up storefronts, young men with old eyes loitering on corners, a sense of hope deferred. The Cadillac pulled up in front of the familiar brownstone on St. Nicholas Avenue. It looked smaller than he remembered. For a moment, he hesitated, his hand on the door handle. He was more afraid of this reunion than he had been of any rival or any cop. He was afraid of the distance the years had created, a gap that love alone might not be able to bridge. Junie gave him a reassuring nod. "They're waiting for you." Bumpy took a deep breath and got out of the car. He walked up the stone steps, each one a monumental effort, and pushed open the door to his home. The smell was the first thing that hit him. The scent of Mamie's cooking, a scent he hadn't realized he'd forgotten until it filled his senses, bringing with it a tidal wave of memory and loss. Mamie stood in the hallway. She had aged with a quiet, powerful grace, the worry of the past decade etched around her soft eyes. She didn't run to him. She just stood there, her eyes drinking him in, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. They met in the middle of the hall, and he held her, burying his face in her hair, the simple, solid reality of her presence a balm on his soul. Then he saw her. Standing in the doorway to the living room was a young woman. She was tall and poised, with his eyes and Mamie's smile. This was Elise, his daughter, no longer a face in a photograph, but a living, breathing woman. She was a stranger, a beautiful stranger who held his entire history in her gaze. He felt a chasm of 12 years open up between them. He was the man who had left, the ghost who wrote letters, not the father who had raised her. What could he possibly say? Elise looked at him, her expression a complex mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and a deep, inherited love. She saw not the king of Harlem, not the Alcatraz inmate, but the father she had missed every single day. She saw the cost of his life in the lines on his face. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her hug hesitant at first, then strong and sure. She rested her head on his shoulder, and in the quiet of the hallway, with the scent of home all around him, she said the two words that stitched his broken world back together, the two words that signified forgiveness, acceptance, and the enduring power of family. "Welcome home, Daddy." Bumpy Johnson closed his eyes, holding his daughter for the first time in over a decade. The empire was gone. The power had faded. The fear he once commanded was a distant echo. But here, in this hallway, holding his wife and his child, he was finally, truly, home. He had his kingdom back,